The invasion arrived like dawn, gradually, then all at once. Northern watchtowers burned first, then border settlements, then military outposts that were supposed to represent the kingdom's first line of defense and instead represented, as the corrupted ledgers had predicted, gaps dressed as fortifications, positions that looked defended on paper and weren't. Enemy banners crossed the Frostfang Mountains with a confidence that spoke to advanced knowledge of where the holes were, which meant someone had provided that knowledge, which meant the betrayal was not merely financial. It was strategic. While enemy forces advanced from the north, Lord Severin Crow moved from within. His supporters, cultivated across years of favor and obligation, seized key administrative districts. Council loyalists occupied government buildings. Several military commanders who had always placed their careers above their convictions made the calculation they had been deferring and declared for the council. Riots erupted in the capital. Violence moved through streets that had been peaceful for years. The kingdom now fought two wars simultaneously, one at its borders, one inside its own walls. The particular cruelty of this was not lost on Thorne. He had spent his kingship preparing for the first kind of war, external, legible, the kind with fronts and formations and clear measurements of success or failure. He had inherited no preparation for the second kind, the one where the enemy wore familiar faces and the battlefield was every institution he had spent his life trusting. Most rulers in this position would have done what rulers have always done in extremis: consolidated, declared emergency authority, suspended opposition, ruled by necessity and called it virtue. Thorne gathered the kingdom's military leaders, pack chiefs, and territorial representatives inside the Grand Assembly Hall, every seat filled. The tension was the specific tension of people who have run out of options and are waiting for someone to tell them which bad choice is least catastrophic. He stood before them and said the thing none of them expected. For too long, power has been concentrated in too few hands. His voice was steady, deliberate, not the voice of a man improvising but of a man who has been thinking about this for longer than anyone knew. If I answer this crisis by becoming another absolute ruler, I become part of the problem. He formally surrendered emergency powers. The room erupted. Garrick stared at him with an expression that contained genuine disbelief. Commanders argued. Advisors protested. Several people spoke simultaneously about the impossibility of what he was proposing. Surrendering authority in the middle of a war, in the middle of a coup, in the middle of the worst crisis the kingdom had faced in a generation. Thorne listened to all of it, then raised a hand. The kingdom needs trust, he said, not control, and trust cannot be demanded. It has to be earned. The decision prevented a third front from opening, the civil war that would have erupted if he had seized the power his position technically allowed. But it came with a cost that was entirely personal. He had removed his own safety net. If he was wrong about the people in that room, if the trust he was extending was misplaced, there was no mechanism now to catch him. He had chosen to be vulnerable because he believed vulnerability was what the kingdom needed to see. It was the bravest thing he had ever done, and the most terrifying. The final battle began in the Frostfang Mountains during the first heavy snowfall of winter, a setting that appeared, in its brutal indifference to the humans fighting through it, to have chosen sides and chosen against everyone. Snowstorms moved through the peaks in waves, reducing visibility to what could be reached by an outstretched hand. The cold was not merely cold, but the kind of cold that makes the body recalibrate its definition of tolerable and decide that tolerable means alive. Wolves fought in it. Steel found steel in the white blur. Men navigated by sound and instinct and the particular knowledge that stopping was the same as dying. Thorne fought at the front. He always had, not as a symbol or a performance of leadership, but because he genuinely believed that authority without shared risk was a kind of theft, and because the men fighting beside him deserved to know their king understood what he was asking. Hour after hour the battle continued. Neither side found the decisive advantage. The mountain was the most powerful thing on the field, and it did not favor either army. Then the mountain acted. There was no warning. One moment the world was the ordered chaos of battle, noise, movement, the comprehensible madness of men fighting for their lives. The next, A sound arrived that was so large it didn't sound like a sound at all but like a change in the nature of reality. A crack that propagated through the rock beneath everyone's feet. And then the ridge gave way. Thousands of tons of snow and ice and stone moved downward with the total authority of gravity unleashed. Warriors scattered. Some made it to stable ground. Many did not. And King Thorne Blackwood, last seen moving toward the ridge to direct a flanking maneuver, disappeared into the white. One moment he was there. The next he was gone. The battle eventually concluded. The survivors searched. Hours became a day. The day became two. Search parties moved through the debris in the systematic patterns of people who believe they are looking for a body and are maintaining the ritual of hope because the alternative is unbearable. No body was found. No trace. Only the mountain which revealed nothing. The news reached the capital at sunset. For most of history's great announcements, there is a moment of ambiguity, a breath between hearing and understanding during which the brain does its quiet work of deciding whether to believe. The word traveled through Blackwood the way all terrible words travel, in waves from person to person, each carrier hoping in some way that it would become less true through retelling, that the story would change if it passed through enough mouths. It didn't change. Candles appeared in windows, prayers in temples. Soldiers lowered banners without being ordered to. Entire villages held vigils beneath moonlit skies, gathering in the particular way communities gather when they need to share grief, because individual grief is too heavy to carry alone. Even people who had opposed the king, who had found his choices dangerous or naive or disruptive, found themselves mourning because he had fought for something, and the loss of someone who fights for something is different from other losses. The kingdom had lost its symbol, and where symbols disappear, the things they held together begin to come apart. Lyra received the news in Ashmere village. She stood very still while the messenger spoke. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the architecture of the world rearranging itself around an absence. Then she became aware of something else. The mate bond. It was faint, stretched thin by distance and whatever the mountain had done. Felt like a thread pulled nearly to breaking, but not broken, not severed. Still there, in the specific way of things that are reduced to their minimum but have not yet ceased to exist. She did not tell anyone. Nobody would have believed her. She barely believed it herself. But she also could not grieve him the way the kingdom was grieving, as something finished, concluded, past. Because the bond said otherwise, quietly, insistently, against all evidence. And Lyra had spent her entire life learning to trust what her body knew before her mind caught up. So she grieved and did not grieve simultaneously, the specific emotional position of someone who has lost something but cannot accept the loss as final, and is not entirely certain which is the more honest response. She returned to work. Not because work healed grief, she knew better than that, but because people needed things and she was capable of providing them, and the absence of need doesn't wait for anyone's sorrow to resolve. And in returning to work, she stepped, almost without noticing, into something else entirely. The first request was modest. A nearby village needed medicine, and Lyra arranged delivery, the kind of practical problem she had solved 100 times, drawing on the network of connections she had built over years of simply being useful. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that required prophecy or bloodline or divine sanction. Just a healer with knowledge and relationships organizing a solution to a problem. But then another request arrived. And another. A settlement needed food distribution organized. Refugees were arriving at the border of 3 different territories simultaneously, and no one was coordinating their care. Military commanders, overwhelmed with the war and its aftermath, requested civilian assistance they had no capacity to provide. Pack leaders in adjacent regions were in dispute over territory and resources, and someone neutral needed to sit between them. Lyra handled each thing as it came, not because she had decided to step into any particular role. Because someone needed to act, politicians were arguing, and people were suffering in the gap between. What happened next is the kind of thing that can't be planned or manufactured. People followed her. Not because prophecy demanded it. Not because authority designated her. Because they had watched her solve problems without seeking credit, make decisions without seeking advantage, give her own share away to ensure others had enough. and they trusted her in a way that bypassed the usual mechanisms of political trust, which are built on calculation and reciprocal advantage. She had earned the real thing, the kind that doesn't require enforcement. A farmer told another farmer about what she'd organized. A commander passed word to a colleague about her handling of a supply crisis that had been a week from becoming a disaster. A pack leader, after watching her mediate a territorial dispute with a patience and fairness that left both sides feeling heard rather than defeated, sent messages to 3 other pack leaders recommending they speak with her before making any major decisions. One morning in a temporary supply camp that had been strained beyond capacity, Lyra was informed that there simply wasn't enough food for the refugees who had arrived overnight. Officials argued. Accounts were reviewed. The conclusion kept arriving. Insufficient resources. She asked for her own portion. Had it distributed first. Others followed her example. Then more. Then more still, until the camp had done something that the official ledgers said was impossible. Provided for everyone. Not through resources she didn't have. Through example. Through the oldest, most reliable mechanism of leadership, showing rather than demanding. A soldier witnessed it. Told another soldier. The story traveled. And with each retelling, a title emerged that Lyra hadn't chosen and didn't particularly want, but couldn't seem to prevent. The heart of the kingdom. She heard it and was embarrassed by it. She understood why people needed symbols, had always understood this, had spent her whole life helping people find something to hold on to when their circumstances made holding on difficult. But being the symbol was a different thing than providing the care that helped others find theirs. The title persisted anyway, because people needed it and because she had, without intending to, demonstrated what it meant. Far away in the capital, Lord Severn Crow followed these developments with growing unease. Lyra Ashmere was becoming the kind of dangerous that couldn't be addressed through the usual methods. She had no faction to dismantle, no allies to pressure, no political position to undermine. She was simply present in places where people were suffering and making those places slightly less terrible, and the effect was accumulating in ways that couldn't be quantified or targeted. She was becoming a living argument against everything the old order depended on. The argument went like this. Here is a person with no noble blood, no political title, no inherited authority, no council endorsement, and the kingdom trusts her more than it trusts us. What does that mean? It meant that the foundation was shifting, and Severn understood, with the clarity of someone whose entire identity depends on a system, that if the foundation shifted enough, the structure built on it would not survive. Time was running out. Then the northern enemy launched its winter offensive, coordinated attacks across multiple territories, defensive lines collapsing, supply routes severed, communication failing. The capital prepared for siege. Some noble houses opened quiet negotiations about terms of surrender. Even hope, which had briefly revived around Lyra's growing influence, seemed to run out of endurance, which was the exact moment the scouts returned. Their reports were confused at first, conflicting, uncertain, the kind of information that arrives when what you've seen doesn't match any category you possess. A force moving south, thousands of wolves, banners none of the scouts recognized, allegiance unknown. Fear moved through the capital. Another enemy? Had the situation become even worse? Then the army reached the northern valleys, and the banners became visible. Foreign pack symbols, mountain territories, river settlements, lands that had spent generations as enemies of Blackwood, some of the oldest and most entrenched rivalries in the region's history, moving together, led by a single figure, scarred, wounded, thinner than before, marked by whatever the mountain had done to him and apparently not stopped by any of it. King Thorne Blackwood, alive. The news hit the kingdom like a second avalanche, but this one moved in the opposite direction, carrying not destruction but something else. Relief so profound it manifested physically, in tears and shaking and the particular laughter of people who had given something up and suddenly have it returned. Because the thing Thorne had done in those months between the avalanche and his return was something nobody had anticipated from a king. He had spent his time not trying to return to power but trying to understand what power was actually for. Stranded beyond Blackwood's borders, injured, separated from his army, alone in territory that should have been hostile. He had done what Lyra had always done. been genuinely useful to the people around him, asked nothing for it, listened more than he spoke, and former enemies had recognized in him something they could work with. He hadn't united those packs by offering them what kings usually offer: territory, gold, promises of advantage. He had offered them something rarer: honesty, respect, and the willingness to serve rather than be served, which was exactly the lesson the prophecy had been trying to teach all along. He had needed to lose everything to finally understand it. The decisive confrontation occurred inside the Grand Assembly Hall, the same hall where a prophecy had interrupted a wedding, the same hall where a king had rejected his counsel, the same hall where Lord Severn Crowe had declared a man unfit to rule. History, as it does, had brought everyone back to the same room. Thousands gathered, every territory represented, former rivals in adjacent rows. The atmosphere was different from every previous gathering, lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because the war was functionally over. The northern armies had withdrawn when Thorne's alliance had made the military calculus clear. Heavier because what remained was the accounting, the truth. Garrick Stone walked to the center of the hall carrying the ledgers, the same ledgers he had ridden through the night to deliver, months ago, at a riverside meeting that had changed the trajectory of everything. Behind him, assistants carried additional documents: correspondence, financial records, letters, the accumulated paper trail of a betrayal spanning a decade. Lord Severn Crowe sat at his customary position among the council members. For the first time in anyone's recent memory, he did not look composed. He looked like a man who has been very certain, for a very long time, that the story he was inside was one where he survived, and is beginning to suspect he was wrong. The evidence was presented methodically, not dramatically. Garrick had no gift for theater and no taste for it, but with the kind of thoroughness that leaves nothing to interpretation. The stolen military funds, the fabricated infrastructure reports, the secret accounts, the decade of deliberate weakening, the palace insignia ring found on the attacker in a forest road. And then the final document: Severn's correspondence with northern enemy forces. Not speculative, not inferred, direct, dated, his own handwriting, proof that he had coordinated with the kingdom's enemies, provided information, suggested targets, helped design the timing of an invasion that killed Blackwood soldiers and displaced Blackwood families, in exchange for promises about the political arrangement that would follow the kingdom's defeat. He had not merely stolen from the kingdom, he had tried to destroy it. The hall received this in stages. Gasps. Then an extended, specific silence, the silence of people integrating something too large to process quickly. Then, from various corners, the sound of supporters distancing themselves. Not loudly, one at a time, a subtle but irrevocable tide. Severn tried to speak. He rose with the confidence of long practice and began the opening of a defense. And nobody listened. Not because they were prevented, but because the room had made its judgment and didn't want to be given reasons to doubt it. He sat down, and in the space of a few minutes, a man who had accumulated 40 years of political dominance found himself entirely alone in a room full of people he had believed he could always manage. The old order did not fall with violence. It fell the way most things fall when their foundations are removed, by simply ceasing to hold itself up. When it was finished, when the formal proceedings had concluded and the arrests had been made and the first public declarations of the new arrangement had been issued, the hall did not immediately empty. People lingered, not because there was more business but because something had ended in that room, and endings deserve a moment of recognition before you turn away from them. Thorne crossed the room, not toward the throne, not toward the council's table, not toward the exits or the military commanders, or any of the dozens of people with legitimate claims on his attention. He walked toward Lyra. The crowd, noticing, gradually went quiet. She stood near the edge of the hall. She had never moved toward the center, never positioned herself anywhere visible, wearing the expression of someone who is not entirely sure what they are witnessing but is certain it is significant. He stopped in front of her. The distance between them, perhaps 2 feet, felt like the distance between everything that had happened and everything that might come next. Then Thorne Blackwood, Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, knelt. Not the formal posture of ceremony. The genuine, undirected, uncalculated kneel of a man doing the truest thing he knows. The hall went absolutely still. "You taught me what it means to serve." His voice was quiet. Not the projected voice of public address, but the private voice of honesty. And yet it carried, in that specific silence, to every corner of the chamber. "You saved this kingdom before I ever could." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes filled, not slowly but all at once, the way eyes fill when something true arrives without warning. The mate bond between them, which had been a thread stretched to its limit for months, settled into something steadier, more permanent, less like something found and more like something recognized. Around them, an extraordinary thing happened. People who had come expecting politics witnessed something else. They witnessed a man who had spent his entire life performing strength, discovering what strength actually required, which was not control or force or the management of other people's impressions, but the willingness to be honest about the limits of what power alone could provide. The king who once believed leadership came from bloodlines was on his knees before the woman who had spent her whole life demonstrating that it comes from service. And every person watching understood, without needing it explained, that they were witnessing the completion of something. Wars end quietly. That is the thing the songs get wrong. They want crescendo, the horn call, the final charge, the enemy banner falling into the mud while victorious warriors raise their weapons at a sky that has been waiting for their triumph. And sometimes those moments exist, briefly, at the outer edge of conflict. But the war itself ends in something much smaller and much more total: exhaustion. The gradual cessation of violence when both sides have discovered that continuing costs more than concluding. Blackwood's war ended in stages. Northern armies withdrew behind the Frostfang Mountains when the strategic situation made continued engagement pointless. Council strongholds across the kingdom surrendered, one by one, as the network of allegiance and obligation that had sustained them dissolved. Rebel commanders laid down weapons. Supply routes reopened. Signal fires lit again on watchtowers that had been dark for months. And then, slowly, carefully, tentatively, like something that has been frightened for a long time and is not yet sure whether it's safe, the kingdom began to breathe. Normal life resumed. Not immediately and not completely. The first signs were small. A market reopening that had been closed for months. A road considered too dangerous to travel being used again. A family returning to a farmstead they had abandoned and discovering that the walls had held in their absence. Then more of it. The accumulated increments of recovery that don't announce themselves but accumulate into something you can recognize. The old order dismantled itself without ceremony. Council estates were seized. Corrupt officials removed. Hidden accounts surfaced. The ancient privileges that had been the architecture of Blackwood's governing system dissolved, not through violence but through exposure, because once the mechanism is visible, its power over willing participants disappears. Severin Crow's downfall passed into the kingdom's memory, not as the story of an ambitious man brought low by his enemies, but as the story of what happens when someone confuses personal power with public service for long enough. The distinction had always existed. He had simply chosen, for 40 years, not to respect it. By spring, Blackwood was united in a way it had not been in centuries. The invasion was finished. The rebellion was finished. The corruption was exposed. The lies were stripped away. What remained was the question that had been there all along, beneath all the chaos and betrayal and sacrifice. What came next? The throne still stood. The Grand Assembly Hall filled for the last time, or at least the last time for this chapter of the kingdom's story. Everyone came. The same hall, the same vaulted ceiling, the same iron chandeliers with their crystal lanterns. But the atmosphere was different from every previous gathering, because the fear was finally gone. When Thorne entered, the reaction was immediate and genuine. Cheers that built until they were filling the hall completely, the sound of people releasing something they'd been holding for months. He walked through it with the particular expression of a man who is moved but is also thinking hard about something else. He approached the throne. The crowd watched, expecting the story to end in the obvious way. The king returns, the king sits, the kingdom is restored to its previous configuration with the corruption excised and the proper order reestablished. Thorne stopped in front of the throne, looked at it for a long moment, then turned away from it. The crowd didn't immediately understand what it was seeing. Then the whispers started, questions, confusion, the spreading awareness that something unexpected was happening. He faced the assembled hall. Every territory, every rank, every person who had made their way here. "When I was a boy," he said, "I believed the throne was the most important thing in this kingdom." Silence. "I believed power preserved order. I believed noble blood preserved stability." He looked across the faces before him, thousands of them, carrying the accumulated marks of a year that had asked more of them than most years do. "But I was wrong." No gasps, no outrage, just attention, the specific attention of people who have learned, through recent experience, that this particular man means what he says. "The invasion did not nearly destroy us because we lacked a king. It nearly destroyed us because we trusted a broken system. The council failed. The bloodline laws failed. The traditions we worshipped failed. And if I respond to all of that by sitting on this throne and ruling exactly as my predecessors ruled, with the same structures and the same concentration of authority in the same hands, then I have learned nothing from what this kingdom has just survived." He paused. "I will not reclaim the throne." The silence lasted longer this time, because the room was doing the thing that rooms do when they encounter something they haven't seen before, trying to find the category for it, failing to find the category, and slowly arriving at the recognition that this might require a new one. "I do not abdicate because I failed. I abdicate because the old system failed. And what this kingdom needs now is not a king who rules it. It needs a structure that serves it." He had not merely rejected the throne. He had rejected the entire theory of power that the throne represented, the idea that the kingdom was something possessed and wielded by a single person at its apex, rather than something tended and protected by the collective responsibility of the people within it. He was giving away the thing that every war in Blackwood history had been fought over. Not because he couldn't hold it, because he had finally understood what it was for. The months that followed changed Blackwood in ways that took generations to fully appreciate. A governing council was established, not the old council of noble houses protecting their interests, but a new structure where representatives were chosen based on merit and experience and the accumulated trust of the communities they came from. Village leaders gained voices they had never held before. Military commanders became accountable rather than autonomous. Scholars and healers and merchants and ordinary people who had spent their lives being governed without being consulted began, slowly and imperfectly, to participate in the thing they had always lived within. The kingdom did not become perfect. It never does. Every system carries its own vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities of genuine participation are different from the vulnerabilities of concentrated authority, but not always less dangerous. What changed was something subtler. A shift in the direction power was understood to flow, from service upward, rather than command downward. Children born after the war grew up learning something different from their parents. Not that noble blood mattered most, that service mattered most. Not that power created greatness, that sacrifice created greatness. It took generations for the change to fully take hold. It always does. But it began in a year when a king chose truth over obedience, a healer chose action over safety, and both of them chose each other over the expectations of a system that had been built specifically to prevent exactly that. The meadow existed in the kind of place that doesn't appear on any official map because the people who make official maps have other priorities. A fold in the countryside, an hour's ride from anywhere, sheltered by low hills and opened by the particular gentleness of land that has never been asked to be anything but itself. Wildflowers in summer, frost patterns in winter, a stream running along the eastern edge that caught moonlight and returned it in wavering silver. It was the kind of place that looks like it has been waiting. A full moon hung above the meadow, not the harvest moon of great occasions, not the blood moon of prophecy, just an ordinary full moon doing what it always does, illuminating the world without comment or condition. Two people stood in the meadow. No guards, no banners, no ceremonies or priests or witnesses of any official kind. No one who would write it down or report it or preserve it for the historical record. Just Thorne and Lyra. They had both been asked in recent weeks what they intended to do now, a question that contained the polite suggestion that whatever they intended, it should be appropriately public and suitably significant. The kingdom had survived. A new structure was in place. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Surely now there was a ceremony of some kind. There was not. They had found this meadow together weeks after the last council session, after the last formal hearing, after the last official thing. They had ridden out in the morning with no particular destination, following no map, and had arrived here in the afternoon and recognized it immediately. Tonight they returned. The mate bond between them had settled into something new. Not the urgent pull of early recognition, not the stretched thin thread of the months of separation, but something more permanent and less dramatic. The particular steadiness of two people who have survived the same crisis and have stopped needing the crisis to hold them together. Thorne looked at her. He had been looking at her more openly lately, now that there was no strategic reason not to, now that the calculation that had governed everything for 32 years had been set aside. "You know," he said, "I spent years believing I needed a kingdom." Lyra looked at him sideways, the particular look she had for moments when he said something that required her assessment. And now, he looked around, at the meadow, at the stream catching moonlight, at the wildflowers beginning to close for the night. Her. "Now I think I only needed this." Her eyes filled, not with sadness, with the feeling that has no clean name, the feeling that arrives at the end of a long journey when you stop and realize you are exactly where you were always going. The mate bond completed in the quiet. No ceremony, no words of binding. Just two people who had each spent their lives carrying more than anyone should have to, finally setting it down in the same place at the same time. Above them, the moon continued doing what the moon does, bearing witness to everything beneath it without requiring that anything be different. Years passed. Children grew up in a kingdom that their parents barely recognized. Seasons came and went with the reliable generosity of seasons uninterrupted by invasion. The trade roads, rebuilt under the new council's first major infrastructure project, hummed with caravans again. The northern borders held, staffed now by soldiers who were actually paid and supplied by depots that actually existed. The legend of the Alpha King who had saved the kingdom and walked away from its throne became the kind of story that circulates for generations. Retold at fires and in classrooms, embellished in some directions and simplified in others, until the actual man beneath the legend was almost entirely hidden by the narrative that had grown up around him. One golden afternoon, a group of travelers stopped near a wooden fence on the edge of a small countryside village. They had been on the road for days and were taking the particular pleasure of rest that people take when they have been moving long enough to appreciate stillness. Their conversation wandered, as travelers' conversations do, toward history. "Imagine giving away a crown." One of them laughed, the laugh of a person who finds the idea simultaneously admirable and incomprehensible. "I still don't entirely believe it," said another. "Who does that? They say he could have ruled forever. They say the people begged him to stay." A few yards away, an older man was repairing a section of fence with the unhurried competence of someone who has been doing this for years and has achieved a relationship with the work. He was listening. His expression did not change. Nearby, a woman moved through a garden collecting herbs, her movements carrying the particular efficiency of someone who has always done this. Not for demonstration, not for anyone watching, just because these things need doing and doing them well is its own reward. The travelers didn't look closely at either of them. Why would they? They were looking for a legend. "If it were me," said the first traveler, "I would have kept the throne. Who gives away a crown?" The others laughed and continued down the road, still debating the king, still wondering about the woman the prophecy had named, still turning the story over in the way people turn stories they find beautiful and slightly unbelievable. The older man watched them disappear over the hill, then turned toward the woman in the garden. Their eyes met, and between them passed the kind of smile that belongs to people who share a specific, particular secret, the secret of knowing that the story everyone is telling is true, and that the truth is simpler and stranger and more ordinary than any of them imagine. Because the travelers had misunderstood the ending. Thorne Blackwood had not given up everything. He had exchanged one life for a better one. The crown for the meadow, the ceremony for the quiet, the performance of power for the reality of a life that belonged to him. The kingdom remembered its king. History preserved his choices. Generations debated his sacrifice and learned from it. And somewhere beyond the reach of official record, where a stream caught moonlight on quiet evenings and wildflowers grew without being asked to. A former king and a former nobody lived the life the prophecy had always been pointing toward. Not a dynasty, not a symbol, not a lesson. Just two people in a place they had chosen, doing the work of being alive together. Which had, in the end, been the whole point.